I'll start off by talking about what I think are the three most relevant capabilities that AI will confer to marketing managers who are charged with CRM, and that is the ability to communicate, the ability to leverage data. So far, I think that would be pretty standard, and the ability to predict. So in effect, I'll be walking through these three columns, and I might also point out that some of the stories are perhaps a little better developed, and others of the stories, as you'll see, maybe there's only one slide. We don't really know exactly. We think it's an important story, but we don't really have much to say about it. So the scale and scope issue and the cross-subsidy issue, I'll spend quite a few slides on. As I get towards the bottom here, perhaps I'll have a little bit less to say, but perhaps you will have something to say about this that could help inform the paper a bit. So why don't I proceed with the leftmost box here, and we'll talk about the three capabilities, and specifically we're thinking that AI year by year will be able to communicate and understand and create the way that humans do. So that, in effect, is part of the definition of what we mean by intelligence. And the fact that it's artificial means that we should see some sort of resemblance to human abilities in this field. And of course, many of those tasks, communication, understanding, and creation, those are tasks that marketers need to do, and specifically their CRM tasks. Of course, AI and related techniques is closely associated with notions of large data sets, and so that is another aspect. Whether it's a capability or whether it's a reaction, I'm not quite sure that I would want to say, but in effect there'll be a relationship between large data and your AI abilities, and so I would like to talk about that from a strategic point of view. And finally, it is really the essence of the state of the art of artificial intelligence at this moment is that what it's doing instead of humans in various tasks into which it's been inserted is prediction. And so we'll focus on that, quite maybe a little bit more than some of these other capabilities. So let's think a little bit about CRM and what CRM means and what and CRM does. So starting with the communication aspect of this, I want to just have you look at this image. Some of you are no doubt familiar with a recent ability that has arisen that is referred to as artificial intelligence that has to do with generating realistic things that are not real. There is much discussion about the societal implications of this. I hope you don't mind if I skip over that part. But from the point of view of marketing, what it does mean is that we ought to be able to use artificial intelligence to create communication that looks and feels very human-like. I thought I would delve into this, and this is maybe the only technical part of this discussion, but I think that it's a metaphor for how we will see the field develop. So I want to get a little bit into this technique. Basically, the way this is done, so each of these paintings is not really a painting. It was generated by a computer, by a machine learning algorithm. Technically not one algorithm, actually two. So let me talk about that for a brief time, and I do promise it's the only real technical part of the presentation. And one of the reasons that I'm emphasizing this is that in the computer science world, there has long been a discussion between two camps. There's one camp that says we should try to imitate humans, and we should actually build computer programs that function the way we know the human mind functions. There's another camp that's more the brute force camp and says, why do we care about that? Why don't we leverage what silicon can do, and just who cares what humans do? We can create intelligence through a different mechanism. And the truth is there has been a healthy dialogue between the two camps, and they're both inspired by each other to learn more about each other's field. So advances in computer science often lead to advances in how we understand how neurons function. Similarly, advances in how we understand how the human mind works have led to have led to advances in how we can program the mind, let's say, with artificial intelligence. So one of the things that psychologists are quite aware of is that the mind is not a single entity, right? So you might be aware of Danny Kahneman's pretty famous book, Thinking Fast and Slow. There's two systems that the humans have of decision. There's the fast system, which basically reacts quickly and emotionally to relatively simple stimuli, and then there is the slow system if I ask you to add three numbers together. And we have both of these structures, and we use them, but we don't think of ourselves as having two brains. We only have one brain, but in actuality, the human thought process is actually decomposable into different structures and different things. And that's what computer scientists are starting to do as well. They're building intelligence that is not really intelligence, it's intelligences. Yeah, that's the right plural, I think. So this technique is called generative adversarial networks, and the idea behind it is actually fairly simple. You have a function that takes pictures, whether they're real or not, and decides whether the picture is actually real or whether it's not actually real. So that function is called D, and X is the input, or something else might be its input. And the role of D as a function is to decide, using a number from 0 to 1, whether this is real art or whether this is fake art. So in one step, we're going to maximize D of X when X is symbolizing the real art, and presumably the function, if it's working well, gives a number closer to 1. And then if it's working well also, when it receives fake art on the right, D of G of Z, it should give a number closer to 0. And of course that's reversed in sign, so we're maximizing the top line. The function D is getting maximized. So it's training itself to discriminate between real art and fake art. Okay, in the second step, you use the function G and train that function to generate a response from D that's as close to 1 as you can get. So in this second step, we're maximizing another part of the mind, if you will, and asking it to come up with something that it thinks will fool D. I use the word thinks, that's not really appropriate, but it's generating data that look like art. And so these rock back and forth until eventually you end up with something that looks like the previous slide. And there you go. So the communication capability is still in its infancy, but has a lot of potential and a lot of interest, I think it's fair to say. So let's shift to another capability, the big data capability. It turns out that many of the astute entrepreneurs in the world have been thinking about data for quite a while. So in an interview about 10 years ago, Jeff Bezos, who is the CEO of Amazon, was asked, why did you pick books as your first product to sell? And the interviewer, and probably everybody in this room, including me, expected the answer to be, they're light, can ship them easily, they don't go bad, they're inexpensive to ship, I can store them in warehouses. No, that's actually not why he started with books. He started with books because he wanted to get data from the kinds of customers who buy books. Another example that I can mention here is when Google bought Grand Central. This is not a product that's very widely used outside of North America, to my knowledge, but Google has a product called Google Voice, which is an alternative telephone mechanism. And basically, they bought it in order to be able to learn how to transcribe voicemail messages. That's why they spent the money on that. So clearly, data as an asset is rising in importance, and it's especially rising in importance with exactly those kinds of companies that we understand have come to be at the top of the global economy. So that's our second asset, our second capability. The third capability that I want to talk about is prediction. And in effect, I think it's fair to say that this is the essence of the state of the art in terms of artificial intelligence. I'm sure you all know the history of this, that in 1950, people were already starting to use the terminology and saying that we would have artificial intelligence within a few years. And of course, what usually happens is that people change the definition of intelligence every 5 years so that humans stay just ahead of the bar and the computer stays just below the bar. At this point, for whatever reason, in 2019, it seems that we've stopped moving the bar. We've decided what we have is close enough to intelligence that it should count as intelligence. And in effect, most of what we have are machine learning, which either classify something into nominal categories or predict in a quantitative sense an actual number. That's the most common output, other than the generative stuff that I just talked about. That's the essence of it, really. So we're trying to predict what a human will do when confronted with this picture. Will they click a button that says cat, or will they click a button that says dog or party or suit coat or something else? There's a waveform of some word that is heard over a microphone. Will a human transcriptionist code that as the word hello or not? Will this move make winning more likely in Go? That's in effect what's really happening. So those are the three categories that I would like to talk about. And as I mentioned, I'd like to spend a little bit more time, or the three capabilities, sorry, I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about prediction and its role. So when I first began teaching marketing research, and I'm sort of thinking I won't tell you the year because it was kind of a while ago, but when I first started talking about it, there was almost always a chapter at the end. Maybe it was in an appendix, but we talked about decision trees. It's disappeared a little bit from the marketing research curriculum, and I think it's a shame because it's a wonderful way to organize strategic thinking and a lot of other things. So for those of you who might not be familiar with, this is a decision tree, and in decision trees there's two kinds of branches that it can occur. By tradition we use a circle to represent something that nature determines, something that's determined outside the system. Will it rain or will it not rain? Has somebody stolen this credit card, or is this a legitimate use? It's some kind of external data that the system has to make a decision about. The squares represent branches at which the human, at least traditionally, the human has to make a decision about what to do. So decision A might be take an umbrella to work today. Decision B might be leave the umbrella at home. So you can see that there's different possibilities. It might rain, it might not rain, and under each of those, I might bring my umbrella or I might not bring my umbrella. And if I bring my umbrella and it does rain, there's an outcome. The outcome would be positive. I'm going to feel pretty good about that. We would presumably measure the outcome with utility, with the notion of utility. I'd get some benefit from that. If I bring the umbrella and it doesn't rain, perhaps my utility is negative in that case. Again, also measurable. Conversely, if my credit card company sees that there has been a transaction in Lyon where I've bought a lovely lunch somewhere, and it decides that, why is this guy in Lyon? That doesn't look right, and it refuses it. There's some negative utility there, both for the customer, for my lifetime value, et cetera. So what the machine intelligence is good at right now is those probabilities that are associated with the states of nature. The rest of it, for the most part, humans need to fill it in. The one thing we especially need to do is to figure out what the outcomes are worth. What's the utility associated with each of these outcomes? Does the car that's taking me automatically to my destination, does it hit the pedestrian or does it drive off the cliff to miss the pedestrian, but I'm in a little bit of trouble then. So what those outcomes mean and how they're calibrated, that's still humanity. Also, for the most part, the actual decision part tends to be human, but more and more that part is getting automated. Of course, if you have studied decision trees, you know that the point of them is that you can calculate beforehand what the best decision is. So you can observe the state of nature and then make a decision, or not observe the state of nature, predict the state of nature, and make a decision based on your prediction. And that can be automated as well, but that's still slightly rare. So for the most part, this is what AI is really up to at this point, other than some of these interesting new examples with the generative adversarial networks where their creation is occurring. Okay. So as far as prediction goes, we imagine that an especially competent, especially capable AI, instead of just predicting whether I'm going to pick Pepsi or Coke at the supermarket, perhaps it could look at some longer-term trends and understand social happenings of some sort, longer cycle trends, patterns. Maybe this is possible. I'm not sure. But that could be something to think about, that especially well-trained AI would perhaps be slightly more strategic than, strictly speaking, CRM would be. Could be maybe more of a big picture, slightly more of a big picture, but I'm not sure about that. One of the things that I am sure, perhaps it's a smaller conclusion, but it's simply more credible and more believable, is that by definition, customer lifetime value, and let me just briefly explain it for those of you who are not CRM fans or aficionados, right? Customer lifetime value is, well, actually it's explained here. It's the present value of the revenue that you expect from a customer. So here's somebody who has a certain history, who have some data on them, and we might expect that they will be spending $50 next month and $60 a month after that, and they'll skip 2 months, and then they'll spend some more money in December, something like that. And of course, the word expected, which I've literally lifted from the definition given of CRM in the book that's cited here, is very close and, in fact, synonymous with the word prediction. So the state of the art of AI and what we need in CRM perfectly mesh. They absolutely are the perfect application. They work well together. All right. Let's see where we're at. So rolling our way through the tasks of CRM, let's start off with acquisition. So in effect, customer acquisition occurs when we identify a customer who is worth acquiring, and they identify us as worth being acquired. So there's a value proposition that, in effect, that the customer offers us. We would predict their customer lifetime value will be 2,200 euro, and there's a value proposition that we offer them. I really like their food, their travel style, you know, whatever our business is. And so we would assume that AI CRM would be better at both of these tasks. If it means anything at all, it ought to be able to predict incrementally that we'll have a little better idea of whom to acquire, and we'll also have a better idea of what that customer will like. Sort of not saying much in a way, and you could argue that the same thing would happen without AI. Maybe we would get better decade by decade just using old-fashioned statistical modeling. Maybe. So I don't think this is really a radical prediction. It's just a incremental, increasing change that we would expect to see. If the I in AI means anything, it means this, right? Okay. As far as retention goes, here things get a little more interesting and a little bit more complicated, perhaps. So one of the things that marketers, both in academia and in practice, have run up against is the complexity of social network data. This is not the kind of data that we grew up on analyzing Not even, 15 years ago, nobody taught social network math and structure and how it works and how influence is transmitted, and now these are very critical, important topics. But they're also topics that are ideally suited for machine learning, where the complexity of the data and even the very structure of the data is complicated. It's not rectangular. It's kind of an ideal ground. So we would expect that the interaction between our customers and the social graph in which they're embedded will be better. We also would note that the networks of which our customers are embedded are not simply networks of other customers. There will be non-human players in these networks, as we're seeing with the Internet of Things, and we assume that we'll be able to retain customers better by leveraging this data and understanding, maybe I should use the word predicting, what they would like to buy. And so this complexity lends itself perfectly well to these kinds of new techniques. Of course, the goal of CRM in general is to shift the customer's focus from hunting for new options to turning our option into a habit. And so presumably that we would leverage this data to do precisely that. So they don't necessarily need to focus on all the players in the market that they are. Instead, they know that we can produce services that match their tastes very well, and so it becomes habitual. In terms of development, we would anticipate some sort of a feedback loop between a deeper relationship that we have with a customer, which then generates better data, and then that better data generates an ability for us to satisfy the customer better. So we would expect some kind of a feedback loop. We're going to have a discussion, I think, a little bit about whether these techniques scale and whether it'll be winner take all. This might be a checkoff on, well, if I have a retained customer, maybe there would be a positive feedback loop with AI such that that customer would likely still be retained many years later, perhaps. So now I'm going to come to 5 stories. As I say, I would prefer that you don't take these literally, like these are exact, specific predictions of the future. Instead, I'd like you to use them as a starting point for discussion as possible futures that may occur. Although I will tell you this, the cross-subsidy story is probably unassailable. I think it's hard to imagine it not working this way. But the other 4, well, perhaps there's some room for things sliding. So machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques require large data sets. That's a well-known property of them. And we can think of data sets as having both scale and scope, almost using the economic terms. And so we can capture more data of the same kind, which is the traditional way that we usually think about it. But we can also capture different kinds of data. And we believe that artificial intelligence is especially valuable to increase the data scope. That's where you start to see incremental benefits in predictive power. However, and now I'm going to go back a little bit, it's quite possible that data scope by itself doesn't scale because there's probably diminishing returns. So after I know 1,000 things about you, it's possible that the 1,001st thing that I know about you is not quite as valuable to me as the 3rd thing that I learned about you. So we think that maybe this won't produce positive feedback, but it will require companies to spend money. Money might matter in terms of generating scope. We do think that firms that own the right type of data will win in competitive situations. So, for example, that the merger and acquisition and channel types of collaboration will accelerate for firms that somehow, depending on the kinds of data that firms have. Sorry, this seems to have not gotten misformatted. I apologize for that. Also, firms in the channel that don't have data, they may be forced to leave the channel. That might be something that is so competitively important that they won't be able to play the game. in effect, the trick will be, in scope terms, what we're really talking about is capturing data from all of the stages of the customer journey. If the companies will maneuver in whatever form they can, collaboration, partnerships, mergers, outright purchases, to make sure they have data from the full pattern of the customer journey. And that's how we think that almost every industry will start to resemble. It'll start to resemble that structure. It won't quite be, for tangible goods, vertical distribution channels that look more like traditional 20th century manufacturing firms, nor will it necessarily look like the service networks that we have in the early part of this century, but that we're going to see agglomeration of firms that match the data channel a little bit. That's something that we're claiming within this story. Other things that I can say, and again, that looks like I overtyped on this one a little bit, but we think that some of marketing tasks will get automated. This won't take a staff of thousands of people. We think that the matching function will work better. In some sense, all firms are really in the business of matching, and that we could also see better differentiation of products, not necessarily by quality, but by style and by type and so forth and so on. Finally, maybe this one could be the main takeaway of our discussion in a way, and I would like to again refer to the essence of AI, at least at this moment, has to do with prediction, and mostly what we care about predicting in marketing is customer lifetime value, the expected value of a future revenue stream. And that's what we nurture. That's the asset that all firms have that must be preserved and grown. And anything that does not lead to the preservation or the growth of the sum of the customer lifetime values is not worth doing for a company. So if the word prediction means anything, it means that what we're going to be able to do year by year, here's a particular customer, refer to that, maybe let's call her customer I. We're going to be able to reduce the error bars of what the customer lifetime value is for her. It's not really such a radical statement, but it actually has relatively important implications. Let's just sort of look at another version of this, another picture of this. If I were to rank order all of my customers by customer lifetime value, which of course most service firms have been doing for quite some time now, starting with the airlines, gosh, when was it, 70s, 80s, and it's spreading into more and more industries as more companies end up with higher quality data. We originally, maybe there's 4 tiers of customers. That's as good as we could do accurately. In fact, most of what's done today is really to distinguish the upper quintile, the upper quartile from the rest. That's about as good as we do today. AI, presumably, if the I means something in the acronym AI, will be able to go from that to, okay, we can divide it into 10. Okay, we can divide it into 40. Okay, maybe even at the individual level, we'll get tighter, we'll be able to do that. Seems pretty plausible. Well, what does this mean? All right, let's go back to 1953. No. 1955, all right? So we have a plane filled with happy passengers. It just so turns out that this lovely couple in the front here are probably never going to fly again. They're on a lark. They're traveling to somewhere for the first and only time of their lives. And the couple in the back there that are being pointed there, they are loyal, repeat customers that are probably going to pay this airline over the next 10 years thousands and thousands of euros, or before the euro, so let's, whatever, the francs, all right? So there was no way to tell the difference between those. And so what happens? They're both getting the same treatment, and in effect, the high customer lifetime value customers are subsidizing the low customer lifetime value customers. They didn't have any signs on their head, so we're stuck treating them all the same, and the money we make from those people is being used to pay these, to give these people good service, right? That's kind of what's happening. Let me fast forward a few years, and I love this. I just sort of love the contrast here. Probably many of us in academia do a fair amount of flying. So now it's 2019, and we have the we have the high CLV customer who's sipping some champagne, and life is really quite beautiful. She practically has her own airplane. I mean, let's just say it. And she's got, it looks like lovely finger food. And here's the rest of us in the back. We have no space. You can't even fit in your seat. And so we've learned to not do the cross subsidies, because it's capitalist imperative, right? We're trying to make money, and we're trying to grow customer lifetime value, and so there you go. So we would expect this to increase. In fact, you could argue that from 1955 to 2008, it happened without AI. So what is AI going to do? It's going to let us do it better. And it'll allow us to do it less expensively. It'll allow us to do it, as soon as we get data, we'll be able to do it in more and more industries. And we're going to see this pattern throughout the economy. So the high CLV customers are going to be subject to intense competition, because at least for the firms that have the data, will know who they are and they'll go after them. The low-end consumers, the low CLV consumers, they will be, in effect, reduced to mass markets where there's low costs, but somebody will fill that gap. But the somebody that fills that gap will do so under the expectation that it has to be high volume, low quality, low cost. And I assume that will still exist. They will be served. But we'll have more and more of these splits. And I'm making it into a dichotomy, but it's not inconceivable that there could be almost an infinite number of gradations, well demarked, as AI gets better at predicting CLV. All right, so maybe here I will toss in a little society. So the high CLV customer is probably going to be technologically ready. They're going to be obviously well off. They're going to be, and they will be younger, and they will be protected, and other people not so much. So it's easy to see how this happens in the airlines, but as the quality of the data that we get in other industries starts to grow, presumably we'll see this basic trend, which we're all aware of, but it's basically a data-driven trend. So we might see separate markets for different customers. Here I've got three lovely hotels. The one's not so lovely over here. And so that's the first, that's the second story. The first one is the data scale and scope story. So the third story, and now things will move along a little faster because I don't think we have such good quality predictions, but one of the things that you may have noticed with self-service technology, airport kiosks, self-checking at supermarkets, they often get rolled out before they're ready. They're usually flawed. Somebody decides they're going to save money, and so that's when we consumers start to interact with them. I think AI CRM will be the same thing. So AI CRM will be less perfect initially and will be more perfect later, but in between we'll still start experiencing it, so there'll be this kind of vague, unknown transition period where things might be a little, what's a good word, ugly. Things might be a little different, difficult, mistaken, errors. So the transition period itself, rather than envision AI CRM as an endpoint, well, how do we get there? And we'll probably get there slowly with some mistakes along the way. And that may be bad for customers and for companies, at least if the rollout of self-service technology is any indication. Another thing that is an interesting aspect of this that, to be honest, I'm not really sure how it's going to play out is, well, maybe the consumer will end up with AI. So they'll have some way to fight back. They'll have some ways to pick up the deals. They'll have some way to leverage their data. They'll have some way to, they'll be just as smart as we are, and it'll be hard to throw them into this bottom market, for example, because they'll be really smart and they'll be strategic, or at least their AI will be strategic. So, but who will provide the AI for them? Maybe like something like an Apple, something like I'm using the App Store as an example here. Will it be user-friendly enough to work for everybody? Basically, the question is who will provide it and what will their role be? For at least 10 years now, there have been a whole variety of platforms out there whereby you can control your own data, and then the platform will sell it to the companies out there that need it and want it. I know you must have heard of this, and I'm sure there's somebody somewhere who once used one of these platforms. But it hasn't happened yet. Hasn't taken off yet. The market for this seems logical for the consumer to defend themselves. It doesn't exist. It doesn't have enough liquidity to get started for whatever reason. So I think that's a little bit of an ominous sign. If I had to predict now, I'm not sure this will happen because other things related to it don't seem to have happened. Again, I'm kind of just waving my hands a little bit. The role of government. So antitrust law is typically driven by pricing. I think that's true in all of the Western democracies, right? So we look for signs of market power as the ability to raise prices. But we have a different kind of player in the economy now who, in fact, not only do they not ever raise prices, they have a free product and it keeps getting better and better. So how is this antitrust exactly? So the regulators are struggling to deal with the facts of the new economy, and one wonders whether governments will decide that CRM as a capability by itself, that customer retention by itself is a sign of too much power. I don't know. That might be what it takes, though, if there's going to be regulation. Let me also point out that regulation is not regulation. We might see in broad strokes completely different approaches taken by different parts of the world. At the risk of overgeneralizing, we might expect the EU to be more protective of the consumer. We might expect the US to be less protective of the consumer. We might expect the People's Republic of China to be more government related, and the government would have the data and use the data. You know, just throwing this out there. So it might play out differently in different parts of the world as well. And I think am I getting close? One of the things that's been noted about AI systems is that they're black boxes. It's very difficult to decide why the machine told you that this guy was a good customer and this other person was a bad customer. So things will happen. You'll end up in the back of the plane and you won't know. Nobody will know. They can't really tell you. They'll say, well, the computer said so. That's what you'll get. Right? That's the nature of AI. It's a black box, at least now. There's a movement within computer science to try to make it more transparent, but I don't know how well that'll succeed. The reason we use AI is precisely because it does stuff that we can't figure out. So I'm not sure they'll solve that problem, personally. And when does the regulation start? During the horrible transition period. It's horrible. The perhaps stumbly transition period. Does it ever start? You know, these are open questions, obviously. I think. Okay, so there's my review of the little stories. The effect on competitive structure is going to be a little bit hard to say whether it'll be winner take all or not. I'm hoping Greg will talk a little more about that. It'll follow the consumer decision journey. We have markets that will no longer be cross-subsidized. The better customers will no longer subsidize the worst customers. Transition period could be a little messy. The consumer side AI, I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. And the regulatory issue as well, I'm not really sure how that'll play out as well. And I think with that, I might have a few references for you to look at, and I am finished. If I can turn this off. Thank you. Thank you. I'll leave this here.
Thank you so much, Charles. Well, we have a few good news, maybe some other that are pessimistic for the future of AI CRM. I prepared a few slides to share with you and maybe highlight a few key topics related to Charles' talk. If I get the right presentation here, yeah. Okay. So maybe before I even start, why Numberly may be relevant to discuss this topic of AI CRM. Is there anybody in the room that has never heard about Numberly before today? Okay. Okay. So like 60% of the audience. So that's great. So what we do at Numberly for more than 20 years now is data-driven marketing. And maybe 2 slides just to give you a few inputs about who we are. We always start with a why, and this is, I think, of critical importance when we start talking about AI CRM, to start with a why, and see AI as a means to serve a specific strategic objective. And our why at Numberly is really about what we call customer intimacy, building differentiation thanks to the quality of the relationship that you have with your customers. So we are really into CRM, but you can use AI in different kind of strategies, from product leadership to operations. But the key topic for us is driving value through a long-term customer relationship. So we basically do 3 things for most of our clients. The first step being how we can help brands and retailers build a data asset. So we are really activating data here, how we can analyze this data, and finally, how we can leverage, activate this data in basically 3 fields of expertise. The first one being CRM, what we usually called omni-channel orchestration. The second one being programmatic activation, what you mentioned, Margareta, real-time bidding campaigns, and being able to take real-time decision to better target your customers. And the third field of expertise being conversation platforms, so chatbots, for instance. So maybe a few highlights and a few topics that seem to me very relevant. The first one being data as an asset, the fuel for AI. You mentioned the scope versus the scale of data, and I think this is critical. We often start our presentation by mentioning that data should be seen as a battle. And there is a battle, and in the US, most players are absolutely okay to classify data-rich and data-poor players. You can be data-rich in the taxi industry, Uber, and you can be data-poor in exactly the same industry. So it's absolutely not a matter of sector or product category that you're in. And for long, it has been pretty simple. You had 2 main types of players. The brands on one side and retailers on the other one. Retailers for long used to be data rich. They invented loyalty programs, for instance, and brands used to be data poor and dependent on the retailers to get access to consumer data and for CRM or targeting or personalization. And it is now pretty different in the data battle, because a new kind of players, actors that we can call the GAFAs, the walled gardens, you name it as you like, finally came up so quickly that they really are shaking the market. Retailers that used to be the richest in terms of data assets are not anymore the richest. So the capacity to leverage and collect non-PII data, cookie data, what we usually call first-party data, is now the new fuel for AI to get scale. And this is really changing the ecosystem of the data battle. So I think that there is here a key point about the ecosystem. We we often talk about the walled garden, the famous one, the big ones, versus the open internet. But the open internet is usually not so well known. We usually identify quite well what is a walled garden, and we usually have in mind the three main ones, being Google, Facebook, and Amazon. But we usually don't see that internet is coming from an open mindset in which advertisers invest money to advertise and are financing the system of the free internet. Internet is free thanks to advertising, basically. And the open mindset of the internet culture could be threatened in a way by new players coming in. So just one figure maybe to give you an idea. So this is the share of time that we spend on several platforms when we consume digital content. As you see, we are spending 35% of our digital lives on the Google ecosystem. So it means that every 3 minutes, we spend 1 minute in the Google ecosystem. It could be Waze, it could be YouTube, it could be search, whatever. And around 15% on the Facebook ecosystem. So we could summarize basically what is data marketing. If we spend 50% of our digital lives on 2 platforms, it means that 50% of the worldwide data is going to 2 players on the market. In terms of investments, advertiser investments, if we make the sum of the investment made in search, mainly Google, and in social, mainly Facebook, as you can see, it's not 50%, it's 80%. So there is a consumer side of the way we consume content and generate data, and there is the business side on how advertisers spend money for digital advertising. So if 80% of advertiser investments are made on 2 platforms, then we have this figure that we have almost every year, I would say for 4 years now, more than 90% of the growth of digital advertising are driven by 2 players, Google and Facebook. So there is a key concern about what we usually call the open internet. And I think for the topic of AI CRM and who has a form of data ownership, who can leverage, who can get some scale as fast as possible, have the speed and scale to develop stronger and smarter AI. I think the topic of walled gardens versus the open internet is absolutely key in the way it would grow over the next years. So the open internet, basically the time and space that we all spend outside the walled gardens. So the 50% of our digital lives that we don't spend neither on Google or on Facebook, to simplify. Why is it a concern for AI? I think, and AI CRM, I think for 3 reasons that I mentioned here, and that you mentioned also, Charles. The first one being AI implies for business innovation, of course. This is a key topic for innovation. And the way the market is shaping, in a way, could either foster innovation or kill innovation. And competition is a key driver of innovation. And with less and less competition in the market, and the open internet being, in a way, a bit threatened by the walled gardens, it could basically kill innovation, with 1 or 2 players basically developing AI for everybody else. And this is a key concern. So it's a bit the scenario of there will be either a winner take all, like Google in a powerful position today, basically being able, or in the position to get access to 100% of worldwide data, or is there kind of a network of AI to be invented with many stakeholders involved, brands developing their own AI, either consumers developing their own AI that could drive or increase competition in the market. If every single customer develops his own AI, gets smarter in the way they do shopping, then it may increase competition actually, or at least foster competition and innovation. So this is the key point. The second key element here is AI implies to invest. And the way, again, the ecosystem is shaping is that many players tend to develop an economic dependence to a few players. And this economic dependence could actually break a little bit the pace of possible investment made in AI. And the third one is that AI is really about learning curve, and I would say even an iterative process. So you test, you learn, you fail, you do it again, and you succeed by learning from possible failure. And this is a key matter of sovereignty here. In the way we can build our own learning curve as any kind of players, it could be retailers, it could be brands. If we don't own our data and if we don't build our data asset, how can we get a learning curve in AI, then create dependence? So this is a key topic to develop, I think, a network of multiple AIs and multiply the stakeholders involved in developing AIs to foster innovation, competition. So we have, I think, even as Europeans, to better understand what is the open internet and invest in the open internet and see what is at stake with the possibility to develop multiple AIs for multiple players in the market. So I think this is key. And this is, the slide for fear, but of course there is from brands, from retailers, so the one who invest money in the system, a growing need for transparency. If they don't, understand enough what AI is, who has developed this AI, what is it for, what is the algorithm, what is it making or predicting. Actually, if we don't develop on our own this kind of algorithm, then there is a growing need for transparency, and we have a few recent news that really show it. And one of my last points is that discussing what you said, I think that we have a high risk of, or at least a key concern of opposing, in a way, AI and humans, with kind of fears from science fiction, possibly, fears for our jobs, fear for new jobs creating, possibly, that AI may, contribute to destroy. We have sometimes some figures that are a bit frightening. So my last point would be, or a suggestion would be, that value comes from the interaction of humans and AI, even in CRM, because the relationship is the whole topic here, and that's it's a high risk to oppose AI and human interactions. So I have a lot of slides, but this one is like, I put in perspective AI from the first research seminar at Dartmouth. We are in 56, so the topic is quite old, actually. But just to give you maybe an example of how AI and humans can work together and finally make sense, I would say, in AI CRM. I just give you an example of what is happening for a call center if you have a strong call center, and what is the distribution of incoming calls at every hour of the day. So as you can see, it's like a classical curve, but that doesn't really fit with human working hours from 9 to 5. So we have dealt with the topic of how AI could finally bring more value for call centers, for instance, and how AI could fit the curve, the demand curve of incoming calls. So a few examples that are I mentioned here. The first one being, of course, what we call the callbot. It's not a chatbot, it's a callbot, developing an AI to serve several objectives to let's say, improve relationship with customers. The first one being, thanks to a chatbot that receive incoming calls from the call centers, customers experience a decrease in the waiting time when they call of the incoming chain, a decrease in incoming useless calls served by operators. Many customers tend to call the call centers for like something very basic that a robot or an AI could do like in a few seconds. So by reducing the number of useless calls served by humans, AI can finally bring value with operators dealing just in case of there is a need for human here. Things when the interaction is really human oriented, and a decrease of lost calls. So this is just how AI could finally fit a demand curve, and because I do believe in how AI can finally bring value for every stakeholder. This example, I think, is quite relevant when it brings to connecting the dots of strong data analytics and machine learning with digital interaction of my customer base, so first-party data, cookie-based data, and the call center, and how finally the customer knowledge that you acquire through first-party data and data collection, your cookie database, can finally be connected to the call center to better serve exactly this customer, depending on previous interactions, and possibly prioritizing outcoming calls from the call centers, depending on what you just made over the past 2 weeks, and give you a probability of conversion, for instance, or purchase. And in that case, I think the business case here created value for many stakeholders involved, with customers having a much higher satisfaction rate after dealing with the call center 2 times, a much higher conversion rate, so customers finally feeling better served by the call center, and a strong effect on operators' engagements, finally finding back value in their jobs, and having amazing feedbacks from clients, finally taking the phone and saying, "Oh, thanks for calling me. I wouldn't expect that you called me, but it's exactly the right time, because yes, I'm just about to purchase." And if you, I don't know, if you have a few calls recently from your insurance company or your mobile phone provider, I'm pretty sure that it's not exactly the response you made to your insurance company, like thank you. Usually you just hang up the phone. So I think AI can really provide value for multiple stakeholders, and connecting the dots to create value for companies in a network of AIs, and also for both employee and customers. But I do believe that innovation is key, and that the way the ecosystem will shape over the next 5 to 10 years will be absolutely decisive in what AI CRM will look like in the future. And there is like, it's probably like the entry point before dealing with AI CRM, to better understand the ecosystem and what it will look like to develop probably, let's say, more valuable AI CRM with a social mindset and a mindset of innovation and value creation for many stakeholders. And I think that is key. So I think I had 20 minutes, so I don't want to be too long. Margarita, you just tell me. So I have a few business cases again. I don't know if you, just like when it comes to AI and humans working together, I'm sure, Charles, you know the Stitch Fix cave that is, well, best in class. This is a few figures about the share of the revenue that is driven by recommendation systems. You can see that on Amazon Marketplace, it's almost 40% of Amazon revenue coming from recommendation, personalized recommendation. It's 1 in 2 connections on LinkedIn coming from recommended profiles that come in. It's more than 75% on the content you consumed on Netflix. And it's absolutely hard to finally reach 100% of recommendation. And Stitch Fix did it in California, so it's a ready-to-wear company, and it's very unique model in which, as a customer, you don't choose anymore what you will receive and wear in the next few months. So you just it's a subscription-based business model. You receive a box with ready-to-wear items, and it's really a great mix of customer knowledge from AI. You have a long survey when you first visit the website. You have a few interactive mechanics like or I don't like, depending on the lookbook. And then you have personal shopper enriching the recommendation from an algorithm, from a recommender system. And I think that all the value comes from how the personal shopper can finally improve the pre-processing of the algorithm made, and the personal shopper picks up like 5 items in a selection of 100 made by the recommender system, depending on the calls you may have with your personal shopper. So thanks to great interactions with human and AI, we see emerging amazing innovations and amazing business models that are absolutely made based on fully recommended products in which you don't choose anymore what you will buy, which is basically quite new. So this is like the virtuous circle of AI and humans interacting together with Stitch Fix. So you have a strong data catching phase, because data is the fuel again. You have data analytics and processing, and the recommender system selecting a few hundred items that you might like depending on your interactions. And you have human inputs here. Human inputs that selects 5, 10, 15 items that you might really like depending on interaction and personal human inputs that you involve here. You have the delivery, the return is free, of course, and depending on what kind of products you return, then it's kind of data catching, and this is the virtuous circle that here happens, because the algorithm learns from what you send back, and that's what you don't like, basically. And the figures are amazing. I think that Stitch Fix has 4% of product return rate, meaning that 96% of the products sent to the final customers are finally kept by the final customers. So AI and human interaction can really provide value for many stakeholders. So this is like a great use case, I think, that is really in the topic of finally acquisition, because it's kind of disruptive business model, and customer development and retention on the long term. And I think the return rate tells pretty much everything about customer satisfaction and possibly retention, building a lifetime value in a way. Okay, so I think I'm pretty done. We may have a few questions from the audience for either Charles or me, maybe.
I like the discussion in particular of Stitch Fix. That was very interesting case that we might like to look at more for this paper, and also the discussion that you had with the triangles, and some companies are data rich and some companies are data poor, almost by the luck of where they are in the supply chain and what kind of product category it is. And this seems like something very interesting that could be developed, and maybe we'd have some ability to do industry predictions based on this. Some companies are in a much weaker position compared to Amazon, let's say, because my brand needs, but I don't have data on my brand. I just have, Amazon has data on my brand, but I don't. Other companies maybe are in a little better position because they're direct to consumer. So this is a nice hook, I think, for us to think about.
I was also wondering, following your speech, that with quite a few possibly pessimistic stories on the future of AI CRM, to what extent do you believe that the traditional outcomes of CRM, which is lifetime value and profit maximization, customer equity maximization, could finally be maybe shaken by AI with a switch from pure profit making to more maybe social utility of brands, that maybe we could measure one day relationship quality through social utility of a brand rather than pure profit making, because we are dealing with ethics, the way you create differentiation in marketing treatments by investing heavily on your heavy customers and finally abandoning your unprofitable customers. So it's a two-tier customer relationship. So I was wondering whether we could imagine one day something less related to pure profit making and maybe more, I don't know if social utility is the good term, but something more, probably more ethical.
I certainly can't imagine it, and I would have to think, though, it will have to come from external to the system. So companies themselves won't do it on their own, but the voters might want to do it. Regulatory bodies might want to do it. Maybe consumers will be able to do it if they have sufficient AI that they control locally. But the internal dynamic will stay the same unless it is acted upon by one of these sorts of outside forces. That's what I would think.
But on this point, why do you think it should not be considered by the company themselves, especially in their recommendation system? We were lucky a few months ago to have with us Professor Balaguer here, and she spoke about responsible AI and the bias in data and the algorithmic bias. And she gave a talk last week in Rome at Marketing Science Conference on how recommendation system, product recommendation systems should implement ethical variables in their recommendation algorithms. So that's something, talking about ethics to avoid bias, that's something that brands and companies should also include as a variable within their recommendation. So it's, for me, when you present the Stitch example, it's nice to have 100% decision done by an algorithm, but I will feel better also if those kind of ethical and responsible and non-biased actions are also taken into account. And for me, it's not only the regulators. I'm not a big, huge fan of auto-regulation, by the way, but still, brands have something to do here. So I think, I don't know what you guys think, something that could be also relevant.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. One input is probably that we see already emerging is probably linked to also the blockchain, I think, that brings much more transparency for any stakeholders involved somehow in CRM, in shopping experiences. The second key point is probably how data scientists that build algorithm every day are trained. It's a key point. They usually don't even realize that they bring their own bias in the way they build algorithm. We have, cognitive bias that you are not even aware of when you build an algorithm that really translate in the recommendation you get, etc. So I think this is really a topic in which we need not only regulation but a strong involvement of multidisciplinary experts from probably from data science to philosophy to ethics, but we are really in the process of shaping and designing the future of machine learning and AI. So this is probably the key topic to provide even regulators with content creation and experts sharing their views on what should be the future, not only strong regulation, but also involvement of multidisciplinary experts.
I was thinking, as you were asking your question, a little bit of how it is a popular trend for companies to have a chief ethics officer is becoming more prominent. And the suggestion might be that these sorts of individuals or departments within companies will need to educate themselves to the unique, strange ethical dilemmas that come up with AI. For example, the bias that might come up and those sorts of things. And this may not be easy, but it would be a suggestion that companies' ethical thinking will have to expand and become relatively technical, because detecting the bias or fixing the bias is not something that's very easy. And so it could almost lend itself to a new specialty, maybe a new master's program or something, ethics in data science or something like this. And but it's quite interesting. The other thing is that I suspect that within a company, the discipline or the area that is most sensitive to these kinds of arguments is precisely marketing. So the pure data science people who are a bit more technical and are skilled in the data science but aren't so aware of marketing implications and thinking about the customer, maybe might have what you could call a blind spot. It really requires somebody who's somewhat technical in knowledge, but it has a marketing sensibility to pick up on this. So it's another task for us to all train our students to think about these things, our marketing students. Margarita wanted to say something or add something.
No, I would just to follow up with a specific question. In your perspective, Charles, Greg, how okay, value creation is clear, which is the value from the marketing point of view. I know better my customer. Using machine learning, I can have a higher level of retention and I sell better my product. But in terms of value capture, how the ecosystem changes. So there are different actors that work against or with you as a platform provider. So how the ecosystem changes, which are the perspective in terms of changes, and also how the value capture changes. Because it's no more money, it's our data, or better knowledge of customer, or what else? I don't know.
My first answer would be value comes from data. So the richest today are the richest in terms of data. The way the ecosystem is, I think, changing is that we see more and more, as exactly as you mentioned, Charles, partnerships developing and growing fast, even between players that were not specifically friends before. So data and AI are shaking relationships between players. A key topic for the coming month, at least, is the development of partnerships between brands on one side and retailers on the other. So it's like partnerships in the open internet. So it's a key strategic move for Carrefour, for Walmart, for Tesco, and also for Danone, Unilever, P&G, to finally start a dialogue with their retailers and then to develop data partnerships that are win-win in a way. I still spend money in advertising, but I get access to your data to measure accurately the efficiency of my marketing dollars investment. So partnerships are probably in the next, let's say, 1, 2, 3 years, the key thing that will reshape a little bit the ecosystem of data marketing. More and more partnerships and more transparency between stakeholders, which is a kind of response to walled gardens that tend to harm even more and more black box, and putting forward privacy as